Death of Game Monster Hunter Wilds. This is a video that was brought to my attention during a live stream recently, and I was kind of surprised because I wasn't aware of the fact that Monster Hunter Wilds was dead. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure we're about to get some news on an upcoming expansion in one of the multitude of events that is happening during the Summer Game Fest. And in that expansion, we're likely going to be getting hundreds more hours of gameplay on this game that already has hundreds of hours of gameplay. It is important to mention, however, that Monster Hunter Wilds is not a live service game. It is always a game that is intended to be supported for about a year and change. And then, Capcom works on an expansion, which it will support for another year and change. And then Capcom goes on and moves on to the next Monster Hunter title. That's usually the way those things go. However, I'm curious to see what NerdSlayer has to say about this. Before we begin, though, I like NerdSlayer's content. I've seen a lot of his content in the past. I think he does some interesting points, so I like his stuff. I think that we're likely going to disagree on the interpretation of how Monster Hunter Wilds is doing. We'll see how all of that goes. And it is also important to mention, I am biased towards Monster Hunter. It's just that simple. I'm a Monster Hunter fan. I really enjoy those games. So we'll see how things go. But before we actually play the video itself, I just like to point out, please, if you get upset at this video, do not go and, start messaging NerdSlayer Studios and leave negative remarks on the video or anything like that. I think it's important to, get criticism for the video games that we like. I think that's actually a good thing, depending on how valid the criticism is. But regardless of that, don't harass other content creators, please. I know that my community is not going to do that, but just in the eventuality that this video goes outside my usual circle of people that watch my videos, all right? But anyways, without any further ado, let's get things started and see what's going on.
Hello, detectives. We have another case that has us returning to Japan, the land of online RPGs that almost always focuses more on action, graphics, and power gaming.
Okay, I'm sorry that I'm pausing this fast. Online RPGs, this is a optional co-op game. You can do all of the content in this game solo. I think the one thing that might be really challenging to do solo is 10 stars Gogmazios. But, even that, I'm pretty sure that you can do it. It's going to require a bit more effort than most of the other stuff. Even Savage Omega can be done solo with the NPC companions. I wouldn't really call this an online RPG. It's a hunting game that has optional co-op. It's just we as a community really enjoy playing together, so we end up playing together quite often. But, yeah, online RPG is a strange classification for this game, in my opinion, but feel free to disagree with me on the comments.
Of online RPGs that almost always focuses more on action, graphics, and power gaming and progression in their games. While we have already covered the founding pioneer in the genre, Phantasy Star Online, being a pioneer in more ways than one for Japan as they brought them online and online on console too, a unique element of their market in fact. We haven't covered the much bigger commercial hit series, though, that spawned from its foundations, Monster Hunter. For reference, while Phantasy Star Online was widely successful for its time by comparison, it made somewhere in the realm of 1 to 1.5 billion over its long life cycle, over 2 major titles. Compare this to Monster Hunter and you see the difference in scale, as it was able to make well over 8 billion in revenue. The Monster Hunter franchise accomplished this by establishing a working formula. You choose your weapon type serving as your class, party and teammates, usually other players like in Phantasy Star Online, and you choose which monsters you wanted to hunt, as the series name implied.
I'm just thinking, is modern Monster Hunter an adequate comparison to Phantasy Star Online? I mean, definitely not to the latest entry that I've seen of Phantasy Star Online, the one that they put on Steam and stuff. I played that game for a while. I forget what was the name of it. But they also had the classical Phantasy Star Online in that version of the game that I played, and that I find those to be very, very different to Monster Hunter, because it's just the overall vibe. The thing that is kind of similar in these games is the structure. It has a structure which you have a hub, you have quests, you go on the quests, You get materials, you craft better gear, you go on harder quests, so on and so forth. But I almost feel like that's where the similarities end. But I should also admit I don't really play enough Phantasy Star Online to comment on that. But I find that, particularly when it comes to more modern Monster Hunter entries, like from Monster Hunter World onwards, I feel like those two series are so far apart at this point.
Star Online, and you choose which monsters you wanted to hunt, as the series name implied. This successful and simple formula has netted the series a bunch of titles, but the series was largely local until the massive success of Monster Hunter World, which dropped back in 2018, and its expansion, Iceborne, which would manage to sell a combined whopping 44 million copies, more than every single Monster Hunter game in sales combined prior.
44 million copies, that's crazy. I still, for some reason, the number that I have in my head is still like 25 million copies of World and Iceborne together, because I don't really look into the sales figures of games, other than like at the very beginning. Like I know that Wild sold 11 million copies up until this point or something along those lines, but I had forgotten that World plus Iceborne's 44 million copies. That's crazy, dude.
Since then, the series has only largely continued to grow, managing to continue to sell quite well and make a presence that is now known way more globally than just its most popular market in Japan. This was all leading up to their launch of their biggest title yet, or at least the one that was set to be, Monster Hunter Wilds, in the beginning of 2025. While this title would manage to blaze through selling 8 million copies in just a jiffy, it would ultimately peter out at just about 11 million copies sold, a far cry from their last few titles. And since has been rated mixed according to Steam, meanwhile the previous two titles there are rated very positive by comparison. The game's populations.
Interesting that that's kind of like how we're talking about it, because in the beginning, the interpretation of Monster Hunter World, for those of you that weren't around, there were actually people that said, oh, this is not Monster Hunter, and the reviews were also not particularly excellent at the beginning of Monster Hunter World. Although Monster Hunter World had a delayed release, so first it released on consoles, then it released on PC, and then eventually it was a little bit mixed in the beginning because there were also performance issues. Not as many as Monster Hunter Wilds, mind you, but there are also some performance issues there. I remember that. And then when Iceborne came out, that one stood mixed for a while because of performance issues, because I remember watching those reviews. This was a while ago, but I do remember watching those reviews. There were some performance issues there. And then further along the way, Iceborne received a bunch of more negative reviews because of the introduction of Alatreon, which was a particularly hard boss fight that people didn't like, and so they took to Steam to protest, like, this is too hard, goddammit, I don't like this mechanic of, there's a one-shot mechanic in this boss. And then when Fatalis came out, yeah, people, so it's like, let's not pretend that World and Iceborne have had flawlessly glowing reviews since the beginning. That was not the case, okay? Those games also took their fair share of criticism. That's not to say Wilds doesn't deserve a lot of criticism, particularly when it comes to the performance issues, which I wrongfully assumed during the alpha that the team was going to iron out, and they sure as hell didn't. I mean, they improved on it, but yeah, there still are performance issues in this game, which is one of the biggest complaints. But that's not the only one. There are other things. I could stay in here for like 2 hours talking about some of the things that people don't like about it.
Started incredibly positively, and now as of May of 2026 is sitting at less than 2% of the original game audience, having lost the
Wait. Did he say started incredibly positively? Wait, what? I'm confused.
Rated mixed according to Steam.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the previous two titles there are rated very positive by comparison. The game's population started incredibly positively, and now as of May of 2026 is sitting at less than 2% of the original game audience.
Yeah, that's usually what happens in a game that has a planned ending. The game ends. I'm not sure if, there's a notion that this game should continue forever. It won't. As a matter of fact, it's about to get an expansion. I mean, it's not about to get an expansion. The expansion is about to get announced, which means it'll probably get an expansion within the next year or so. But even after that expansion comes, it will be supported for probably another year, maybe a year and change. And then the exact same thing's going to happen. The game has an endpoint. There is a point where you will have done everything there is to do in Monster Hunter Wilds. And there will be a point where you have done everything there is to do, or at least all the things that you care to do in the upcoming expansion, Monster Hunter Wilds, G rank, whatever they're going to call it. And at that point, you move on to another game because that is the healthy thing to do.
Having lost the other 98% in just over a year. What went wrong with the most popular ORPG or MMORPG franchise globally and a
Wait, what did he call it?
audience, having lost the other 98% in just over a year? What went wrong with the most popular ORPG or MMORPG franchise globally?
MORP, are we calling it a massively online RPG franchise now? I do not agree.
And a founding father of the genre, having been putting out titles in that field for 22 years now. We will find out that and more, including...
Let's also remember that none of the previous titles were nearly as successful as the launch of this one, and none of the titles that came before World were nearly as successful as World itself, which I still think is currently the most successful, which also, Base World is my favorite Monster Hunter.
Most importantly, the largest contributing factors to the failure of Monster Hunter Wilds. The Death of a Game series is a series where...
Why would we say... Okay, so we can say that Monster Hunter Wilds did not achieve all of the sales that it probably could have achieved. I still think in large part due to the performance issues, because I kind of... From everything that I've seen from the community, that is one of the biggest complaints. And I know that people will be quick to point out, yeah, there's the sacred, the whole automation of going from place to place. There's the, less aspects of hunting simulation. We talk about these things every day on the stream whenever we're playing Monster Hunter, right? So there's still some of those things, but I feel like those are a very small... I could be wrong, but I kind of think like those other issues are a very small section of the community. I think that the biggest thing that caused this game not to sell as well is performance issues.
Contributing factors to the failure of Monster Hunter Wilds.
But to say that it failed, it sold 11 million copies. It sold 11 million copies. I'm not sure I would consider that a failure.
The Death of a Game series is a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game's death or process of dying by utilizing a timeline of events, filled with clues and bits of evidence. Most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Choose your weapon, detectives. We have some monster hunting to do.
Gunlance. Bro better be a
Story
Gunlance
begins
main.
with the ever-growing Monster Hunter series, originally formulated back in 2004 as a largely handheld-focused series, which it would remain.
I love the fact that he used Brachydios from 3 Ultimate in that. Hells yeah, dude. Third Fleet! Let's go.
For like another 12 years. That was until Monster Hunter World would make its appearance on consoles in the beginning of 2018 before following that up with a PC launch in the fall. Before this point, the series had largely sold the best under the Freedom moniker, a PSP Monster Hunter title that would have as many as like 3+ titles released under it, and well, 3 more if you count Generations as well, and well, eventually Monster Hunter Rise. Why would you count these? Well, that's because the lead director behind those games was the same guy, Yasunori Ichinoshi. This is relevant because in Japanese game development especially, game directors have particular styles and ways of handling titles, and oftentimes alternate from game to game, which can have some serious style and design impacts on the next game. The next leg of the race for Monster Hunter was their 4th iteration, Monster Hunter 4, and the Generation series and of course Ultimate follow-ups, which would both prove to be even more successful than the previous Freedom styles commercially. Monster Hunter 4 and all mainline titles were
I'm so confused when he says Freedom. Like, because like 3 Ultimate is not Monster Hunter Freedom. There's Freedom Unite, and then there's 3. There's also 3rd Portable, which we never got to see in the West. Through emulation and whatnot, yada yada. But it's just strange to me that the Freedom entries, like it's very confusing. Like maybe I'm not understanding it. I am sleep deprived.
and oftentimes alternate from game to game, which can have some serious style and design impacts on the next game. The next leg of the race for Monster Hunter was their fourth iteration, Monster Hunter 4, and the Generation series and of course Ultimate follow-ups, which would both prove to be even more successful than the previous Freedom styles commercially. Monster Hunter 4 and all mainline titles were
Okay, so he's saying that 4U and GU were more successful than 3U and Freedom Unite, I guess? Yes, correct. 4U was one of the most popular ones. Because, like, for a second there, it almost seemed like he was implying Generations and Generations Ultimate were more popular than 4 Ultimate, which I'm not sure is correct. I'm also not going to say it's wrong. I'm not going to look that up at this point. But, yeah, I think that 4 Ultimate was probably the most popular before Monster Hunter World. Could be wrong. I don't know.
directed by none other than Konami Fujioka, including the more successful previous Monster Hunter 3, which was particularly known for being rather difficult. Following the ultimate release of Monster Hunter 4, Fujioka would shift to the executive art director on both World and Wilds in the future. The lead planner of Monster Hunter 4, Yuya Takuda, would become the next game's lead game director, a developer who originally was a passionate, hardcore Monster Hunter gamer who wanted the game to have more realism and immersion to the series. Takuda was in charge of Monster Hunter World, which would manage to sell a whopping 44 million copies across the base game and expansion, and, well, all platforms. A title that is often accused of being a strong departure from the Monster Hunter series by its fans, as it focused more on immersion and simulation aspects that would be required to hunt monsters properly. The slower and more deliberate combat and positioning was a bit of a turnoff for some with Monster Hunter World, as what came alongside it was a rather difficult game, especially because
slower and more deliberate positioning? Then what? Generations Ultimate? What? I'm so confused. I'm pretty sure that every title that came before World, well, I guess the pacing of combat, it depends a lot on the style that you're using and stuff. Maybe the styles I was using were just not that. I guess with dual blades, you could go really hard on GU and stuff, but I'm calling it like slower and more deliberate in World than previous ones. I'm a little bit shocked. That's not what I'd call it.
some with Monster Hunter World, as what came alongside it was a rather difficult game, especially because as you progressed and took on more difficult foes, some gamers being unable to even complete the game's more difficult bosses. A callback to the
Here it comes! Here it comes! The engine actor, he's gonna vindicate me! You hear that, meat man? Nerd Slayer's gonna vindicate me, dude! You'll see!
series' third game, a notoriously difficult one. This was significant because, as Capcom would later confirm, a large amount of the next title in the series' focus would be trying to meet a wider range of players, including cutting down on things like travel times, allowing for auto-travel mounts, and more, as we will discuss later on. Development would start for Monster Hunter Wilds as the next premier title would be dubbed, sometime in 2019 or later, ultimately being in development for about 6 to 7 years before being released. Being developed as well with Capcom's proprietary RE engine, the same one that was used for the majority of the Resident Evil and other Monster Hunter games too. But Capcom wasn't just focused on the next major Monster Hunter title, Wilds. They were also cooking up another Monster Hunter title, one that was a bit more handheld and console focused, of course. Monster Hunter Rise was a return to Yoshinori Ichinoshi of the Freedom and Monster Hunter Portable fame, which was kind of like the majority of the audience, like both literally and historically at that point. Well, of course, up into World. Yasunori liked making his games have simple focuses, where shining in the action combat and overcoming your foe department, there was more about what his main focuses were about. Yasunori games have a distinct action feel to them, and are more approachable on the base level than the other Monster Hunter titles, including from Takuda. Monster Hunter Rise was this taken to the next level, with even more.
Monster Hunter Rise definitely had the easiest village quests. Like, Rise Village, I think might be the easiest Monster Hunter has ever been. Straight up. A lot of people have been saying like, nah, Wilds, low rank Wilds is easier than Rise Village. And I'm like, no, I don't think you're remembering Rise Village, brother. I'm not saying, low rank Wilds is hard by any stretch. It's super easy. But, Village Rise? Nah, dude.
Including from Takuda. Monster Hunter Rise was this taken to the next level, with even more approachable combat systems and a difficulty level as a series title. A more cooperative-focused adventure, as it took just one tutorial mission and you could be playing with up to 3 of your friends too. Rise did a lot right, including taking the same seamless map approach that World had made famous for the first time in the series, and then making the game easier and more accessible in some ways outside of that. But there was some early writing on the wall, as the game would demonstrably be easier than World and even prior Monster Hunter games, but ultimately didn't have the same impact as World, as it was essentially just a handheld game or Switch game that was ported to other platforms like the PC. This could even be seen in the game's presentation, to be fair. It still sold massively impressively at 28 million copies sold, including with its expansion Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, though over half of the game's sales had come from just the Switch. While Wilds was Takuta's game, I think Rise was really worth mentioning because it's the closest comparison to Wilds in many ways, even over World in my opinion.
Rise is the closest comparison to Wilds over World? I am so confused.
Because it's the closest comparison to Wilds in many ways, even over World in my opinion, all the way down to the game's base design. Main difference being, on the surface, Wilds was looking to be a serious player on PC, like World was, and taking elements from Rise's design there might have proven problematic because of that. Though it did mimic one major aspect of Worlds' design, which was how progressing through the main story or campaign would be linked to your progress or gameplay in multiplayer, which would prove to be quite problematic later on. Monster Hunter Wilds would be publicly announced December 7th, 2023, being the first time the public really got to see how serious the title was in the production aspects, both in how many high-quality trailers would be churned out and how high-quality the cinematics were for them. Not a whole lot of info was released about the game's actual systems though, and the reason that was significant was that they were introducing many of them for the first time for the series, and by not revealing them before launch, they couldn't really draw upon feedback from that, I would think. And unless they were working through the holidays, I don't even know if they would have enough time to collect the feedback during their open beta 1 in October 2024. This beta would only run for 70 hours, and during that time was able to balloon up to an impressive over 460,000 concurrent players on Steam. The success was insane, but the bigger problem was the feedback being given and how little time they were actually going to have to fix things.
Oh yeah.
Wilds like World and Rise had an open world, but a much bigger one, with some zones being 2 to 3 times the size from the previous games. This, alongside how the title was clearly highly focused on a high-fidelity graphical presentation, would contribute to some serious performance issues plaguing players since the fall 2024 beta. The next open beta would drop just a few months later, February 15th, 2025, which was just weeks before they were set to launch. Problem was, the performance wasn't fixed, and anywhere from mid-range to high-end PCs were suffering from the CPU-heavy bones of the game, and alongside the high-res texture pack that you would need at least 60 gigabytes of RAM to use. The DLSS system, or temporal upscaling, was also a mess and often required, as it would make your game unknowingly blurry in the process but increase your performance. Even on consoles, Wilds was suffering, as it would even drop from 60 frames in the performance mode, and that was with a scaling internal resolution that could sometimes drop as low as 720p, with the higher quality mode only being able to scrape just 30 frames. Wilds was gorgeous though, but at what cost? Its giant map size and likely high pixel count was causing innumerable performance issues. And considering this was just weeks before launch, there was no way that Capcom could actually alleviate these issues.
This is all correct, by the way. He's 100% correct. Yes, performance issues, which, like I said at the beginning of the video, this was our biggest problem in the game. I think that this is one of the main reasons for the game not being able to sell more copies. 100%. So yeah, he's from most of the stuff that he's saying, I completely agree. Yeah, there were a lot of performance issues. I really thought the team was going to pull through, which is why there is a video on my channel where I talk about it. I'm like, no, I have faith in this team, and should not have done that. I still have faith in the team, but yeah, they let me down when it came to the performance stuff. The performance of the final game was significantly better than the betas, but nowhere near close to where it needed to be. specifically for earlier systems. However, I should also mention, and I know that a lot of people are going to say that I'm just, carrying water for Capcom, I'm making excuses for them, yada, yada, yada. So let me just assure that is not the case. The performance is not acceptable in any stretch of the imagination. I would just like to point out, however, that NVIDIA fucking up drivers repeatedly during that period of time also did not help out. To give you guys an idea, there was a multitude of messed up drivers from NVIDIA around the months of launch of Monster Hunter Wilds. And don't worry, because AMD was like, no, NVIDIA's messing up drivers? Let us go ahead and make that even worse as well. So AMD also messed up drivers during that period as well. So yeah, as a matter of fact, I think that for a while, I had to downgrade my AMD drivers because there were so many problems with previous ones. And then a lot of people were complaining. I downgraded my AMD drivers because of Path of Exile 2, which was an unrelated thing to Wilds. So I was using downgraded drivers, and I was like, yeah, my performance is fine. And people were like, how are you playing the game? This is literally unplayable, because everybody had the latest AMD drivers, and I had already downgraded for another game. So there was like a period of performance issues in Wilds that I straight up skipped through it because I downgraded drivers to play another game. So the driver issue also contributed a lot, but it was not the main cause, not even remotely close. I'm just saying it didn't help.
Before, which despite the stellar marketing the game had been pushing, would likely lead to a lot of copies bought and then quickly abandoned. Monster Hunter Wilds would launch globally and on all major platforms February 28th, 2025, including where we're going to focus the most, the Steam PC launch. First tackling the critical reception of the game though, which was actually pretty fantastic at 88 out of 100 from 100 plus different critics. For example, IGN Japan was quite high on the game, rating it a 9 out of 10, where they would call its world meticulously crafted and vast, and explain that they had very little complaints about the game, such as just the game's story pacing near the end. IGN Japan enjoyed the noob-friendly system of wounding now added to the game, where you could stun monsters by targeting their weakest parts, and sometimes even repeatedly stun them, making it quite easy for beginners and pretty much everyone else alike. IGN West, if you would like to call them that, would rate it a bit lower at like 8 out of 10, saying it was an obvious smoothing of some traditionally rougher edges of the series, in smart ways in their opinion, and that its flexible combat was some of the best in the series yet. But the critical reviews of Wilds were troubling for many reasons, to put it bluntly. Wilds was a perfect review game, where it was very much designed, more so for the first time, with its narrative-driven story mode campaign, to be beaten by its player base, and completed, which you can do in just like 15 hours, with no difficulty to speak of along the way, really. It was like the perfect video game journalism game. But once you start to...
Damn. It's like... He's not wrong. You can complete the story very fast, but he's also not mentioning, I'm not sure if he's going to mention it later, that completing the story means completing low rank. That's something we got to keep in mind. When he says 15 hours, he's talking up until the point where you get to, I think it's Zoshia? Yeah, I think it's Zoshia. Right? Zoshia is the last thing we do. I forget if it's Zoshia or if it's Arkveld. I'm pretty sure it's Zoshia. But yeah, he's talking about up until the point where he defeats Zoshia for the very first time. That's the 15 hours. He's not talking about the high rank that comes after. Not to say that that high rank was particularly challenging, at least not until you get to like max difficulty at the time, which was it 8.5? No, it was 7.5. 7.5 Gormagala, something like that. That's when things start getting a little bit more challenging. But even then, if you're using Palico, because Palico is extremely OP in Wilds, yeah, he'll just tear through. I mean, he won't tear through Gormagala, but he will ensure that you tear through Gormagala.
Evaluate the player reception and reviews of Wilds, you realize that the critics and players had vastly different experiences for some obvious reasons I'm going to outline shortly. On Steam, from 80,000 plus Steam reviews, Wilds was the worst rated Monster Hunter game on Steam yet, at just 69% with a mixed score. The largest complaints largely ignored or unnoticed by the video game media, were that the performance of the game was absolutely abysmal, with some players having extremely powerful PCs still eventually running into performance issues where they would have to clear their shaders after every new update. And worse,
that was like, I want to say that was one time. Was that not one time? Am I mistaken? That had happened more than once, having to manually clean our shaders? I remember because I launched the game at one point and it was literally unplayable. I was like, what the hell? There had been an update. And I remember doing that update and I was like, oh, damn, the game's just like really messed up. It seems like it didn't do the shader caching because we were used to seeing the little progress bar fill up. And so I went and I Googled how to do it manually, and I even posted like on Twitter, and I made a video about people. Hey guys, make sure to clear your cache because you have to do it manually this time around for reasons. But I only remember that happening once. I could be wrong. But that's what I remember.
Into performance issues where they would have to clear their shaders after every new update, and worse, being unplayable for those without a spaceship. The next major issue was the difficulty level of the game was non-existent almost all the way through it. Even non-veteran Monster Hunter gamers were claiming that they were able to beat the story without ever dying a single time, and doing it even completely solo as well, which was made significantly easier to make the game apparently more approachable to more kinds of players.
I mean, ever since Monster Hunter World, I mean, even in previous games, unless you're doing... Well, no, I guess before Monster Hunter World, when you get to high rank, that's when you want to start doing co-op and stuff. But in World, you can do the entirety of high rank completely solo, with the exception of some event quests like Behemoth. You can still solo Behemoth, but yeah, you're going to have a bad friggin' time. Same thing for like Extreme Leshen and whatnot. There are a couple of other things, I think. Oh yeah, Kolth to Roth, obviously. But you guys know what I'm saying, right? It's like mostly high rank can always be soloed. Pretty much since World, you can solo everything. And, you know, since World, even G rank can be soloed pretty much because they scale it. Whereas in previous games before Monster Hunter World, they were not scaling stuff. You know, it's just like, hey, this is scaled for multiplayer. You bring more players, you have an easier time. You're playing by yourself, you're going to have a harder time. That's the way that it goes.
Significantly easier to make the game apparently more approachable to more kinds of players. And veterans were claiming, according to my sources, that the game was essentially easy mode up until the later updates would add some more challenging fights, and even that was just like 3 to 4 of them at max.
Whoa, 3 to 4? Nah, dude, when we got 8, well, wait, 8.5s? Yeah, 8.5s was like 4 monsters. No, he's right. It was like 4, was it more than 4 monsters? I forget exactly how many monsters we got that were 8.5. But yeah, when we got to, no, it was more, because we got Gormagala as well. So we had the Apexes, and then Arkveld, and then Gormagala. So it was like 6? I don't know. Something like that. But yeah, when we got the 8.5 monsters is what I said. Now, this is where I wanted the difficulty to be. But then they took it all the way to 10.5. So if he's talking about just the earlier updates, he's correct. But in the later updates, that number started growing.
Completely disjointed multiplayer and how it functioned didn't
Disjointed multiplayer.
mode up until the later updates would add some more challenging fights, and even that was just like 3 to 4 of them at max. The completely disjointed multiplayer and how it functioned didn't make matters any better, which...
Oh, yeah, he's talking about people wanted to do, what was it called? Something that we abandoned very, very early, which was synchronous hunting, whatever was the thing where we get to go out into the open world. But we very quickly all abandoned that because, yeah, that was... They didn't really think that mode through. You usually just go to the hub and you do quests with everybody, and that's usually how you go about playing multiplayer. But, yeah, I guess in the beginning it was disjointed, yes.
The completely disjointed multiplayer and how it functioned didn't make matters any better, which also likely contributed to the players playing more solo. That's because Wilds would also introduce player-driven cutscenes and cinematics for the first time, which was great. Being able to actually hear your own voice and have a more integral role in the plot, other than it just being kind of like an excuse to go hunt monsters. There were actual stakes in the story, and characters were more heavily involved. This is a series that was largely essentially just like an extraction shooter, if you want to see it that way.
An extraction shooter? That's the best you could have come up with. An It reminds me of back in the olden days when 90% of gaming journalists would just go, "This is the Dark Souls of this genre," and it's like, oh, okay. Sure thing, buddy.
As you would normally in previous Monster Hunter games, not even interact with the world at all, and just choose what missions or monsters you wanted to do, and then kind of do battle with them. This means that even if I think the game should have more story in it, many players who enjoyed Monster Hunter as a whole would likely disagree, as it's something that they weren't particularly used to, especially with it being so mandatory and not particularly challenging in Wilds, whereas you didn't have a choice and your friends would get kicked out of your party while playing through the story and
I'm not against the story elements of Wilds. I actually enjoyed the story of Wilds quite a bit. I know that that's not a popular opinion, and whatever, it is what it is. But I thought it was interesting. I thought that like they went out there and they were like, yeah, friggin' guardian monsters and friggin' crazy, you know, crazy experimentations they were doing, which led to the downfall of this civilization. We're making this fatalis, crazed looking monster. You know, all of that. I know that that's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. I thought it was interesting, but yeah, there is quite a lot of story, and not everybody is super into that stuff. So yeah, it is what it is. You're not going to be able to. You're not going to be able to please everybody. And if I had to guess, I would say that a majority of the Monster Hunter community would actually rather have less story, more hunts. And I'm pretty sure that all of those stories and cutscenes and all of that stuff was probably a significant portion of the budget.
have a choice, and your friends would get kicked out of your party while playing through the story and transported elsewhere during cinematics. And even having strange quirks like allowing grouping and environment link only to certain areas, blocking off the ability to—
Yeah, that's also real. That's another thing that's weird. Like, they've solved this problem all the way back in Lost Planet 2. That's the one that I remember from Capcom. They've solved this problem all the way back then, where you could do the story of a game with 4 of the players that would show up in your cutscene and everything would be hunky-dory. It wouldn't be a problem. As a matter of fact, sometimes you'd see players with like a Lego head or a Mega Man Buster in you know, in their hands and whatnot. Like you'd see all these crazy looking characters and stuff, and it was fine. It was fine. They solved this problem ages ago. I don't know why this sometimes seems to be an unsolvable problem. It's like, oh, how do we get the other players into the story? It's like, it's not that hard. You guys solved this problem years ago. I don't understand.
and grouping and environment link only to certain areas, blocking off the ability to actually walk around the map and explore, having to reform your group every time instead.
Yeah, what he's saying here is that when you do environment link, which is the thing that I called synchronous hunting earlier, because we abandoned that thing so soon in its life cycle that I don't even remember the name. But when you did environment link, what happened was you couldn't traverse from the Windward Plains to Scarlet Forest, or from Scarlet Forest into the basin. I forget you guys know what I'm talking about. You couldn't traverse between those points. It would be closed off, which is weird. I don't know why they did that.
Actually walk around the map and explore, having to reform your group every time instead, which is just strange with Monster Hunter Wilds being an ORPG at its core, and, bragging about having the
Being a what?
map and explore, having to reform your group every time instead, which is just strange with Monster Hunter Wilds being an ORPG at its core,
ORPG.
and, bragging about having this seamless open world. The actual cooperative experience here was fairly poor in Wilds, which is kind of like a death knell to any online RPG, really.
It's strange because you can tell that he played the game. I'm sure he played the game, but you can tell that he wasn't really engaged in the end game to kind of like understand how the community usually hunts. That's why he's saying that like the co-op's pretty poor. I understand, because like if you want to jump into the game and do environment link, you'll get that opinion as well. You're gonna be like, damn, this multiplayer sucks, because environment link was not particularly good. But if you jump into the game, you go to the Grand Hub, and then you start doing quests with everybody, then the multiplayer is pretty seamless. However, oh yeah, that's another thing that I didn't bring up. SOS hunting friggin' sucks. At least it sucked. I don't know if it still sucks, but it sucked. SOS was really bad, which is, yeah, I guess the if you start looking at it that way, there is a lot of complaints about the multiplayer that do become more and more valid. It's just, being a streamer, I'm not as exposed to it because, I just boot up my stream and I'm lucky enough to have a community of people that be like, hey, let's join Murray's lobby, let's all go hang out and do hunts and stuff. And yeah,
really poor in Wilds, which is kind of like a death knell to any online RPG, really. Finally, we should address two more major things before we move on with the timeline. That's the combat in Wilds, and the monster preparation or actual hunting parts of the game. The combat in Wilds is a super interesting topic, as is combat in general in the Monster Hunter series. That's because some Monster Hunter games like World or Rise were a bit more deliberate, especially World, with combat and approach to combat scenarios wanting players to pick the right moment to strike and paying attention to monster behaviors and attack patterns properly. Whereas games or series like Freedom or Generations, or even the mainline series in some ways, require far less positioning and were more about straight hack and slash RPGing instead. And that's
What? I probably I'm gonna edit this. I've already rewound this once to hear, so it's the second time I'm hearing it because I'm like, he's not saying what I think he's saying. So the claim is that Monster Hunter World requires more positioning than the games that came before it. I mean, it definitely requires more positioning than Wilds. That part is valid, but he basically is saying that the previous games were just hack and slash. That doesn't make any sense. If anything, these games required way more positioning than, World and Wilds and Rise and so on.
Moment to strike and paying attention to monster behaviors and attack patterns properly. Whereas games or series like Freedom or Generations, or even the mainline series in some ways, require far less positioning and were more about straight hack and slash RPGing instead. And that's kind of what the majority of the game's longtime fanbase was used to up into World. But remember, the two most popular Monster Hunter games by orders of magnitude were Rise and World, which had contrasting gameplay styles that some veterans disliked. And personally, I like the combat in World and Wilds. The more intentional combat typically kind of makes me feel that way because you're more immersed into the game. But the problem with Wilds, however, was it was essentially taking too much inspiration from both Rise and World, which despite having similarities in their combat systems were pretty different games overall. Rise was more about grabbing your food, your correct item loadout, and then collecting any spirit birds or spear birds around the map, which would boost your stats, and getting into the action, rarely needing you to take a pause, heal up too much, or have to rethink your strategy other than just banging on things. That was because Rise was designed by the largely portable focused developer and director, Ichinoshi, who never really seemed to be interested in other styles of combat, whereas World and Wilds were directed by Takuda, who originally was recruited into the franchise with the big goal of making monsters have real noticeable behaviors. In a world with a proper ecosystem, Takuda was more focused clearly on things like immersion and World's story. These two clashes would create a problem where if you try too much to be like Worlds, or Rise, or both, you end up with a game that's quite confused about what it wants to be, which I think is the problem with Wilds. Its combat is fine, I think, and many would agree, but the game is too easy, which makes the combat actually worse, because it removes the need to actually have slower and more intentionally paced combat. What you're left with is an incredibly conflicted combat system, especially when you throw in the second point that I'm going to make, which is how little monster prep would go into the monster hunting in Wilds, which was kind of analogous to the series, largely. In Monster Hunter World and previous Monster Hunter games, this was an integral, unskippable part of the game, and that was after they already started adding many quality of life features with World, such as a base camp allowing you to be easily resupplied. Now, some people, myself included, argue that the over-exaggeration of how much monster prepping goes into the earlier Monster Hunter titles is, well, a bit over the top. Wilds is...
No, it's not. No, it's not over the top. I mean, maybe in some of the titles before World, but I feel like in World it's fine. Because, I also don't really feel like we need to go back to the days of mega pickaxes that break. Then I wouldn't mind it, mind you. This would not be a problem for me, but it is not something that I'm like, oh man, I wish my pickaxes would break. But I do go back to the days of I wish we didn't have restock. Absolutely. I don't like restock. I think restock doesn't make any sense. It does diminish the sense of preparedness and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Prepping goes into the earlier Monster Hunter titles is, well, a bit over the top, Wilds' solution to the problem was to streamline instead of adding new ways to approach the problem, or just making them deeper or more fun. This just ends up being kind of confusing in design, as you basically don't want players to be bothered by monster prepping, yet it still exists in a very streamlined state, almost making it like completely trivial. I think Tokuda needed to make the choice to expand more of these systems rather than just streamlining them, because if you only streamline and just file away even the sharpest point of a stick, you're eventually gonna run out of stick. And that's
I do agree with this part, yeah. I do feel like we could have used more prep in Wilds, but I know that a large portion of the community disagrees with me, which is fine. It's fine. We can disagree.
the worst thing about Wilds, ultimately, in the end. It's just an oversimplified and filed-down version of the Monster Hunter franchise that happens to have an incredibly alienating multiplayer system and piss-poor performance to boot. It's pretty, even seriously fun at times, but it's just full of warts and all. Warts or not, Monster Hunter Wilds would still manage to blaze past 8 million in sales at a base price of $70. Wilds would reach massive early success, even managing to reach an unheard of 1.1 million players on Steam and a whopping 308,000 players on average. This number within just 1 month, though, would be first halved and the latter one-thirded. And something I want to address, since I see it commented sometimes on games like this, and well, on my video that was teasing the fact that I was going to cover Wilds, and that's that some people say, well, Wilds shouldn't be considered in the Death of a Game series because, well, Wilds is not a forever game.
Correct.
Shouldn't be considered in the Death of a Game series because, well, Wilds is not a forever game. Even beside that not needing to be a reason for me to feature it, I featured like single-player games and companies, but Wilds in every Monster Hunter game ever is an ORPG.
Smaller scale focus, power grind-centric virtual world that hails from Japan mostly? I have never heard this term.
A staple in Japanese gaming, and this is one of my favorite genres, being one of the first ones that I just ever played religiously with Phantasy Star Online. It's very much a virtual world, even if it's a heavily segmented one, to be clear. And, well, MMORPGs are also not really designed to be forever either, because, well, they can't be. The engine's graphics and gameplay and systems are going to expire, just like other forms of gaming. It's just us players who have more of an attachment to these games because, well, they're more than just games, they're worlds. Sometimes worlds that we find even more hospitable than our own in real life, so it feels like a forever game. But even with games that are constantly evolving with engines and gameplay, like for example, World of Warcraft, you can see the growing pains and then some, especially with the aging systems. Yakuda and team, including long-standing producer Ryoso Tsuchimoto, who had been a lightning rod for the series but also a long-standing member of it, would promise a series of free updates to hit the game post-launch, organized and dubbed as title updates, with the first to launch April 4th, 2025. This update was pretty good, as it added things like arch-tempered monsters from World, which were much more difficult than the other monsters, or the challenge quest system, which also increased the difficulty of the game. It also added a new high-ranked monster in Zoshia, and a returning one in Mizusuni, who hailed from Monster Hunter Generations. But while it was great to see some returning monsters, the problem with Wilds was it only launched with like 28 large monsters. Meanwhile, Generations, speaking of which, had like 73.
Really? We're going to be comparing the monsters in Monster Hunter Wilds that have, ridiculously detailed textures, ridiculously detailed animations, ridiculous detailed AI behaviors, navigating these much more complex maps rather than the arenas that they have to navigate in Generations Ultimate. It's just like making a monster in Monster Hunter Wilds is quite simply not comparable to making a monster in Generations Ultimate. And that's not even bringing up the fact that most of the monsters that were featured in Generations Ultimate were monsters that already existed in that engine from previous entries in the game. And, Generations and Generations Ultimate was essentially a celebration title. This is a title that just kind of like celebrated however many years of Monster Hunter. And the whole point was like, hey, we're bringing all these monsters in. And these are all monsters that already existed. And a lot of them, as a consequence, are not as interesting fights as they were in the games that they came from because of limitations and whatnot. It's like you quite simply cannot compare the number of monsters in Wilds, the Generations. And I know that there's going to be some people that are going to disagree with that, and that's fine. Feel free to disagree. But, if we go back to having, arenas that are linked by loading screens, then I'd be like, okay, you guys got a point. Yeah, you're right. We had 70-something monsters before. Hell, and to the old graphics as well. You go back to having these arenas that are with the loading screens and they're interconnected the way that they used to be, which this is not a problem for me, by the way. I love those games. This is not a problem for me. But if you want to have a game like this, making a monster is a whole different beast. So it's like these are quite simply things that are not comparable.
Large monsters. Meanwhile, Generations, speaking of which, had like 73. These are handheld Monster Hunter games that have oodles of more content and much longer playtimes than Wilds did. It seemed like in the process of reaching a new audience, Capcom had done a poor job of servicing their actual core audience, which was in like the...
Also, why are we comparing Wilds to Generations? Wouldn't it make more sense to compare it to World? This one is just giga weird.
Capcom had done a poor job of servicing their actual core audience, which was in like the dozens of millions, I might add. Despite this great update, the population would tank even harder after another passing month, reaching just 149,000 players peak and 34,000 players on average.
Yeah, because this was the update that broke the shader cache that we were talking about earlier, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was this update. It's completely broken. And the people that didn't know how to manually clear their shader cache, which, by the way, they shouldn't have to. This should have been something that the game should have done. Those people were just like not straight up not able to play the game anymore.
This was seemingly a situation where adding more content wasn't going to fix the sinking ship, which is going to be extra problematic when Japanese development can typically take ages to respond to live feedback like this. Tempered monsters were now placed even in like regular monster herds, and more arch-tempered monsters were added in like Uthduna during the title update 2, June 30th, 2025. But the population was only continuing to plummet, reaching as low as 87,000 players peak at that time, and just 22,000 players on average. The updates weren't bad, they just weren't addressing the core issues behind Wilds, or
which was the performance.
Just very slowly addressing them. But some were arguing that perhaps these couldn't really be addressed anyway. Title Update 3 would drop September 29th, 2025, and in my opinion would add the most difficult encounter to the game yet, and that was the unlikely crossover from Final Fantasy XIV. But this was like 7 months after launch, and although it had a positive population movement, with the peak population jumping up about 20,000 players, I think this new difficulty jump was great and much needed. But it makes me wonder how much of it could have helped had it been done earlier. But heavily relying on another titan in Japan, in the case of Final Fantasy, was a trump card that they couldn't just keep playing every single time or potentially ever again. Title Update 4 would drop at the end of 2025, and it would add another fairly difficult monster, Ngogmasios, being a classic Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate monster, more arch-tempered monsters to conquer, and a 9-star version of Dashaguma and Rathalos. These would certainly help with the making of the game more replayable, and help a little to stop the game's incredible burn rate. But the population had an impact from these changes, jumping up as much to like 122,000 players peak. The most challenging update yet would occur just 2 months later, which seemed to be the cadence the game had been largely following regarding updates. This update would add arch-tempered Arkveld, with Arkveld being the flagship monster of the game of course, and now unlocking 10-star quests too. But really, what was most important to me about this update was the fact that it clearly seemed to be a preparation for something larger, perhaps an expansion, as it would finally actually address the game's VRAM issues, shader problems, and overall performance on PC and consoles. It really sucks that this update took a year to formulate, as this sort of update happening even just 6 months prior would have done wonders for the game, but the population would jump up a bit, reaching 85,000 players peak during this time, but failed to maintain.
I think it's also important to mention that a lot of video games nowadays just experience a lot faster burn rates of population than in previous times because there's just so many video games coming out at any moment. Like, and I know that some people are going to say, "Oh, that's cope." It's like, no, there's a point to be made here where yes, Wilds did lose population faster than it was to be expected. I think a large part of that is due to the performance issues that we experienced when the game came out, and a lot of players just left, never came back. Another part of that is due to the streamlining of a lot of systems in Monster Hunter and less hunting simulation aspects and, you know, stuff that we've talked about bunch of times on stream already, but I also think that there is a factor here where there's just so many games to play. Like even just at the start of this year, for instance, 2026, like I was jumping from Neo 3, what came after that? I don't even remember. It was just like such a blur of like video game after video game after video game after video game to the point where I didn't even play a tenth of what I wanted to play of Crimson Desert because it's just like so many things chalked in between. Stories 3, bunch of other games that I want to check out. And these are just games that I'm interested in, not even talking about games that aren't really my style, right?
Maintain that in just 2 more months, with the game's population falling as low as 32,000 players peak in April of 2026. But more importantly than the update in February of 2026 was the confirmation that Capcom, from producer Tsujimoto, had already been working on a quote, large-scale expansion, which was typical for the franchise, who had some rather positive recent expansions in Sunbreak and Iceborne. This was significant because these expansions did a lot to iron out the kinks of the prior games and add far more to the experience and enjoyment. Some players were even feeling like the expansion here in the case of Wilds could make the same major difference. But having spoken to some of my hardcore gamer sources, they told me that unless the expansion can address the core issues that players were having with the game, it's just going to be more things to do in a container that people really weren't totally thrilled about. And it also doesn't feel good to say that even if they do fix it, that the only way to play the fixed Wilds is buying the expansion after buying the base game for $70, so that means like another plus $40. So in total, you have to fork over $110 and wait for a year or more to play an actual.
I'm like 90% sure that if there are any performance fixes that they add in the expansion for Monster Hunter Wilds, those will actually be applied retroactively in base Wilds, because if they keep doing what they have been doing with these games, they're going to allow Monster Hunter Wilds players that don't have the expansion to play with players that do have the expansion. In order to be able to do that, the game needs to be able to communicate, and it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, oh yeah, we fixed the performance, but only in the expansion mode. Like, that would cause all types of problems in the game code, I would imagine. So any performance issues that get fixed in the expansion, I would expect those to get fixed in base Wilds as well. I could be wrong, but that would be my expectation.
Have to fork over $110 and wait for a year or more to play an actual good game or completed game? Come on, Capcom. Now, while some players might feel you can't measure the success of Wilds by its player count levels just a year removed, you can for 2 major reasons. First, if you consider Monster Hunter Worlds' reception and player data on Steam, you see a much different picture. First, as of May of 2026, World has more players playing it than Wild does, both on
the 24-hour peaks, yes. Wait. Still holding on the same
average and at peak, which is bizarre when the game is 8 years older and isn't producing new content. And during those 8 years,
it's not bizarre because this is one of the things that I've said at the start. Base World is my favorite version of the game. Why? Because it has more attrition. Wilds smoothed out a lot of the friction that the game has. And removing that friction, interestingly enough, and this is something that I feel like a lot of devs could learn from. If you just constantly remove friction from video games, that's actually not a good thing. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest population increases that we had in the game, like Nerd Slayer mentioned in the video, was Savage Omega. What did Savage Omega bring with it? Attrition. It is hard. It's a hard fight. You got to get together with other players. You got to figure out strategies. You got to figure something out. So all of that, good thing. So World has more friction. Therefore, it retains its player base more.
Never drop below the current numbers of Wilds, even after 1 to 2 to 3 years in. Worse, as a measure, Worlds sold 4 times more than Wilds at 11 million copies sold, and in all...
Yeah, World's been out for friggin' 8 years. What is this comparison? Not to mention you're comparing World plus Iceborne versus Wilds. It's like, I agree, Wild should have sold more. You are correct. Wild should have sold more copies. Absolutely. The performance definitely harmed it, as well as some of the streamlining of the game definitely harmed it as well. I agree. But are you really going to bring up sales numbers from 8 years of sales of a video game plus its expansion versus the base game of Wilds? At least, compare it to like, oh, here's how much World sold 1 year in, which I forget exactly how much it was. It was still more than this. It was probably like 20 million. No, I don't think it was 20. I think it was like 18. I could be wrong, whatever. But it's still considerably more than Wilds. Yes, absolutely. But like, you can't just say, oh yeah, this sold 4 times more. Yeah, over the course of 8 years to Wilds 1. I feel like that one was very unfair.
Worlds sold 4 times more than Wilds at 11 million copies sold, and in all of the past 12 months, Wilds has only managed to sell 1.32 million copies sold. That means that Wild didn't just sell worse than World, it sold worse than Rise, a glorified Switch port, and even sold less than the expansion. Wilds wasn't the hit that
I love how he just says Rise is a glorified Switch port. Yeah, like friggin' Switch games suck. Rise is a good game. He barely even talks about Rise in this.
And even sold less than the expansion. Wilds wasn't the hit that Capcom had expected, and there's a strong argument not the hit that they had invested so much money into either.
This part I agree with. It definitely sold less than they expected, and they wanted it to sell more. I 100% agree with that.
Fair. Konami Fujioka is reportedly tasked with working on the next mainline Monster Hunter series, so it will be interesting to see how he, the team, and Capcom in general respond to the reception of Wilds, and naturally interesting to see how they respond to things with the expansion for Wilds, and how much it can really improve the game. But as of now, May of 2026, the timeline has come to an end, detectives. With Wilds having less than 2% of its original audience, it's not totally dead yet, and this video is more so about Wilds, the base game anyway. But I don't think that the expansion will have the same resurrective effects that Sunbreak or Iceborne did for the prior Monster Hunter titles. That's the final reason I decided to feature it here on the Death of the Game series before it was literally dead. But hopefully, you have been paying attention to the clues along the way. But don't worry, in case you missed any of them, why did Monster Hunter Wilds end up rated the worst Monster Hunter game in decades, and the worst selling game in nearly a decade? Serious performance and optimization issues.
Yes.
Caught between 2 very different designs.
Yeah, the whole thing that we're talking about with having less friction, streamlining some of its elements, yada yada.
Over-smoothing led to a game that was just too safe and too easy and
which they fixed. They fixed some of this in title updates, but it doesn't really fix the content that comes before it. So the story, like if you go to experience the story now, it still has all of those problems. It only really gets solved once you get into the end game. Yeah.
Polished. A lack of content. Poor.
Lack of content? I don't think you can compare it to World and say lack of content. I've elaborated on this on live streams. It would cause this video to be much longer than it already is. But yeah, I don't think you can compare it to the success of World and say that base Wilds lacks content.
And confusing multiplayer systems. Well, detectives, Monster Hunter is truly an iconic and long-lasting series that has taken many years to end up on the Death of a Game series. Another truly iconic one, am I right? But I feel happy and fortunate to have covered such an interesting series even if their most recent effort fell quite short. Monster Hunter isn't going anywhere. They reportedly have as many as 2 more games in the works. And for players who didn't quite enjoy Wilds, it seems like Rise and World are serving as a great classic game to scoop up some of that runoff. But this case has come to an end, detectives. We have many more to investigate. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Wilds and any reasons you think I missed for why it fell so short. Until the next case, one that has quite exploded into the recent news and is a sequel of another online RPG we have already covered.
Times may be dark, but
Ooh,
we are
Destiny.
Earth's greatest hope.
See, now that one,
A gathering of
that one is definitely one that, which is very, very unfortunate. But, Bungie really did drive that one into the ground. But anyways, in regards to the video itself, I think that it is an interesting video. I think that it is, in parts, it is definitely something that I even think that it is useful, because there's a lot of criticism here that I think is valid, which I've pointed out during my video. I would recommend you guys come and check out Nerd Slayer. He does a lot of content like this on his channel, so do check him out. Hit the like button. There will be a link in the description below. I like watching the video. There's obviously some points that I really don't agree with, and there were some times that I felt like he was very unfair. Particularly like the 2 big ones would be when he talks about how, oh, Generations launched with 70 monsters. It's like, well, yeah. It's like the thing is, for a lot of players that are just, consuming this video, they're not gonna understand what exactly that means. Like, if you go and you look at gameplay from Generations Ultimate, right? Let me see if I can find a video here real quick. Like, if we go here, just mute this. Like, this is what Generations Ultimate looks like, okay? This is what a monster looks like in Generations Ultimate. And it's like, you see this map here? Let me actually make my face a little bit smaller. You see this map here? This is the only thing that's being rendered of the whole map. Like, if you want to go here, there's a loading screen in between. So the monster behavior only has to contend with this specific section of the map. It doesn't have to actively navigate all the way over here. The monster just teleports here. It's like, developing a monster for this game is fundamentally different from developing a monster in Monster Hunter Wilds. That's not even talking about the upgrades to animations, the upgrades to monster behavior, attack patterns, sounds. Like, it's just not comparable. Like, of course, making 70 monsters that look like this is going to be easier than making 70 monsters that look like what we see in Monster Hunter Wild. That one was just unreasonable. And then the other one was the whole thing saying like, oh, well, Monster Hunter World sold 44 million copies against Wild's 11 million copies. Well, yeah, of course. Over the course of the last 8 years. Makes sense, not to mention it is both a game and its expansion versus just the base game of Wilds. I kind of feel like those two were particularly unfair, but there's also a lot of valid criticism in there, like the whole multiplayer thing, which somebody like me, like I said, I don't even notice it, right? Because we've been playing the game for so long that we know how to do the multiplayer. It's like we know we go to the lobby. I mean, even the thing that I do right now is second nature is kind of dumb, which is I go to the thing and I look for an empty lobby so that I can host 100 players. Because you guys remember when I was trying to do the squad thing and we'd all log in and it'd be 10 players, then it would disconnect everybody, then we'd all go back in, and then it would be 20 players, then it would disconnect everybody again. Yeah, the multiplayer is scuffed. It is. It's just the way that we play it right now, we don't even experience that stuff anymore because I just go in, we take over a lobby, everybody's having a good time, and it's fine. But like, a lot of the multiplayer systems are giga scuffed, and it definitely deserves criticism, and it is. I do think that a lot of this is actionable by Capcom. Like, I think sometimes people see some of these critique videos and they think like, oh man, Capcom team's going to be mad about this. No, this is good for them because they see the critique and they can, oh yeah, there's some actionable stuff here that we can fix, maybe, or at least that we can take into consideration for some of the stuff that we're working on for the expansion. So I think that's a good thing. Very much like the performance issues, which everybody screamed from the rooftops. Yes, there are performance issues in the game. Absolutely. Serious issues. You need to figure this out. But so I think that there's a lot of valid criticism here, and I overall like the video. There are a lot of things that I disagree with, and I definitely disagree with the fact that the game is dead. Like I said, we're probably days away from receiving news of an expansion, but, you know, it is what it is. There's a link to this in the description down below. If you guys enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, bell notification icon, all that jazz. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you, Nerd Slayer, for making the video. That was some cool feedback. Anyways, peace out, team.